Ladies and gentlemen, it's another Crowpill for you. We're going to be dispelling the change of pace fallacy. You know, I actually felt like we needed a bit of a change of pace here on this YouTube channel here with this Crowpill series, only having released 4 thus far, and that change of pace has come from Veek's overlay work. So thanks, Veek, for putting together the overlay. It's a great change of pace, right? A very, very positive one that really only leaves improvement in its wake. Unlike the change of pace that you may have been gaslit into believing is good by the average person who plays a micro mission in an RTS game and says, this is epic. Here's the main deal that I have with the change of pace fallacy. And you know what? The origin point of this line of thinking was when I was ranting to a little someone called Patrick, who longtime viewers of the channel may be familiar with when we did our LPs together. And that individual and I were having a conversation while I was walking through the neighborhood. And I was talking to him about the fact that so many people said that they prefer micro missions every now and then because it's a nice change of pace. And him and I both agreed pretty handily, pretty quickly, that it doesn't make any fucking sense to have a change of pace in the middle of an RTS game. Because in an RTS game, you're here to play an RTS. If you want to play a RTT, an RPG, or any other 3-letter word acronym, at that point, all you have to do is go boot up one of those games. It's the same logic for why it doesn't make any sense to make an RPG within Brood War, where so many people have made quote-unquote RPGs. RPG is such a useless genre term. I'll probably get into that in another video because really it doesn't mean anything. Every game that's classified as an RPG is basically like completely different from the other games that are classified in it. There seems to be no unifying mechanics or consensus as to what makes an RPG. Kind of similar to what makes an RTS nowadays. People think that like RTTs like Company of Heroes or fucking MOBAs or whatever the hell Dawn of War 2 is all classify as an RTS. It's one of those cases where the genre, the label is really just too cliche, too played out at this point to the point where it's lost all meaning. And I think the same is true for even the argument of changing the pace, right? The reason why I call it the change of pace fallacy is that you really don't need to change the pace. What you need to do in order to retain user engagement is to actually engage the user. If you want to get my attention, you probably want some interesting premise initially, but in terms of the core gameplay loop of your project, you want it to be skill testing. You want it to be something that I can show my own level of skill, that I can graph my own improvement on, that I can track how good I'm doing relative to the opponent or relative to my ally or something like that. You want it to be such that it requires enough from me, the player, to really demonstrate my own playstyle in order to actually claim victory. And you want it to be deep enough that it can, in theory, allow for exploration of different playstyles, while also not being so convoluted that it's impossible to jump into initially. So you need something that can be somewhat, relatively speaking, and this is a loaded term in and of itself, but somewhat tutorialized. You need something that can be reasonable in terms of how you present the information of how the game is played to the player itself. And in situations like that, it's very difficult to come up with like good tutorials in an RTS context. I've heard positive things about the Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition tutorials. Haven't played them yet. That will be something that is I'm quite interested to jump into at some point later in this year or next year when I do my playthrough of that particular game. But ultimately, it's just one of those things where, in my own experience, I've never played a satisfactory RTS tutorial. Either the rare few of them that do go into very in-depth with regards to the mechanics, they tend to do a really poor job of sort of pacing the information out so that you can grasp it all. Or they just hit on very, very basic things and don't really teach you that much, especially if you've played an RTS before. They might not even teach you about some new features that this game has over other games. Like the Armies of Exego tutorial did not teach you about selecting buildings before they were actually built, which you would think, hey, that would actually be something you would want to teach us because that's a mechanic that's unique to your game. And yet, obviously, that was conspicuously absent, we'll say. And so that's just something that users find out on their own. I mean, StarCraft's tutorial is much the same way. It teaches you some elements of resource gathering, supply, and so on in one race, in the context of one race. And you build one unit, and you build 2 buildings, and that's it. That's your like 2 building types and 1 unit type. That's all you get out of a tutorial. And then there's like a protracted tutorial later on where you learn what about marines and bunkers and so on over the next couple of missions. And at that point, it's like so poorly paced that there is no actual pace that you can even understand. So you can't even say that there's a change of pace there because it never gets going. There's never actually any pace to change in the first place. So the roundabout example of the tutorial is a great jumping off point here, because tutorials rarely actually ground themselves in the core gameplay loop of the product. And if you don't get grounded in terms of what the gameplay loop is, if you're not really understanding what the gameplay loop is on the outset, when you sit down to actually play the game and look at the tutorial, then you are going in completely blind when you actually try to play the game. I think that there's a way to unify that. I'm sure I'll have a Crowpill video or 10 on tutorials in the future, but when it comes to looking at how tutorials change from, or how the game changes from tutorials to actual content, actual missions in a campaign, it almost always is a change of pace, if you can call it that initially. Like, it's almost always completely different anyway. You're almost never seeing a tutorial be very similar in terms of how you play it to what the final mission will end up looking like, or what any mission of the campaign will end up looking like. And then you get the micro missions, and then you get the gimmick missions, and then you get missions in Brood War where random tech is disabled because the authors just felt like you shouldn't be allowed to use air units in this particular mission. That happens on 2 occasions in Brood War that I can immediately remember, of course. There's the 4th Protoss mission and the 7th Zerg mission. And, obviously in both cases, you can still use overlords, shuttles, observers. Like, it's not even all air units. It's just a select few, I suppose. Pretty ridiculous. So in such situations, people argue in favor of changes of pace, probably because the gameplay loop is never fully actualized. And if the gameplay loop was actualized, if we had a really strong core gameplay experience, if we were playing StarCraft and we had missions that required us to expand, that had AI allies, that had multiple different teams vying in some sort of team free-for-all scenario, or even a smaller scale free-for-all scenario where it was only 4 players, but they were all hostile to each other, then we've got battlegrounds that are more dynamic, and we've got, some sort of team play aspect going on when you do have an AI ally, and some sort of team play aspect when you're fighting against an enemy team, where they're working together in some context, or they're shoring up each other's weaknesses in a compositional nature, and so that when you take out one, you also open up a weakness for the other that either that AI will have to adapt to, or they will just go, continue it down their initial composition and hope that they can still pull it out. In any situation like that, there's instantly more things going on, and we haven't changed what mechanics are available to the player. We haven't removed parts of their tech tree. We haven't made it so that they only control 1 unit, or they only control a hero, or they only control a couple of units, and they have to fight through this slog nonsense where none of the enemy AI is even activated, and all of the units are just sitting there waiting to be attacked in some sort of strange grind half-developed map like all of the micro missions in Brood War. In a situation like that, we've actually maximized the potential of whatever the RTS core gameplay actually is for StarCraft, and we've delivered in different ways a different sort of composition or combination of players, personalities. Obviously a lot of this would be AI related, so driven by the AI itself. And then you'd have, one AI is super aggressive, one AI is super conservative, one AI expands a lot, one AI likes to tech rush, one AI likes to just stay on tier 1 or tier 2 and pump out 1 million units, and they're like Zergling spammers or something, you know what I mean? There's so many different angles you could take within the confines of what constitutes as an RTS mechanic, what constitutes as a Brood War mechanic, what constitutes as any mechanic from any of these RTS games. You can go deeper down that rabbit hole of customizing your various scenarios, your various campaign missions, in a way that will actually lend to RTS gameplay, in a way that will not remove features and thus leave you with a game state that is incomplete. Because that's the other portion here. Anytime you're removing a feature, you have to replace that feature with something new, which is why the only way that you could make a micro mission work is if you had some scenario where all of the APM that you could possibly use was being activated, right? In a situation where you're playing an actual RTS mission, you've got to manage your base, your army, your tech. You've got to attack and expand and defend. You've got to handle allies if they exist. You've got to deal with enemy compositions. You've got to deal with all this stuff. There's even more than that, right? You've got, in some cases, you've got to upgrade if your game state has upgrades, right? There's all sorts of different things that you've got to keep track of. And you don't get a chance to look at that and say, oh yeah, here's a situation, right, where all of my mechanics are like, some of my mechanics are being removed, and yet the game state is still complete, and yet it still feels satisfying to play. We all know this because when we go and play those shitty Brood War maps that disable our tech, we feel like we're just being removed artificially. We have some parts of our personality, perhaps, or some potential compositions we would want to explore, just get randomly disabled, and it doesn't feel like it's and for anything other than in service to the story. Whereas obviously it's a game. The game should come first, and the story should be in service to it if you're trying to make a game. If you're trying to make a story and you're using games as the avenue, I would hazard a guess that maybe you picked the wrong medium. That's all. So when it comes to looking at how all of this stacks up when we analyze a micro mission in a similar sense, through a similar lens, with similar concepts and precepts and pillars of thinking, we can see that really there's nothing there. There's very little there to actually latch onto, because you've got only units to control. Maybe a hero, but usually it's just units. And even the heroes are usually just units that have higher stats. In StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3, heroes were a little bit more involved, but ultimately the gameplay loop was still the same, of walking through some units and grinding through it and just suffering, because there's nothing for you to latch onto, because there's just a bunch of pre-placed units, some static events that happen in linear fashion. There's no AI running in the background where maybe there's a situation where like you've got an allied AI and you can support them on the front lines using your hero or using your micro units or whatever. It would still be abstractions on the main gameplay, and it would still be inferior to playing an RTS, but at least it would be removing less features of what an RTS actually is. At least it would be more in line with what an actual RTS is. And the less features you remove, the more consistent you remain to that main gameplay loop that you're trying to explore and define and refine and optimize when you're dealing with a custom campaign or any sort of content for an RTS. The better your product ultimately is. And so that's why I argue against ever changing the pace in that regard, ever changing the genre of your content. You want to have your genre be consistent. Otherwise, your game is essentially a carnival ride where skill doesn't matter and mastery doesn't matter, at least not as much as it should. And that's really my main gripe with micro missions, is that ultimately they are just grindy nonsense. They're just filler. They're just there because we needed a mission here, but we didn't feel like actually putting in the effort to make that mission fully actualized, fully justify itself. We just wanted to have 10 maps in a campaign, We didn't really care about the quality of each individual map. We just figured, yeah, just throw in a micro mission that you could stim pack Raynor in and complete in under 2 minutes, because that's content, and I'm fine with that. Yeah, of course. Well, I'm not personally fine with that. I don't care what Blizzard has to say or what any of the micro mission apologists have to say ultimately. Though I am interested in people who still, after watching this Crowpill video, have some sort of back talk to say, have some sort of clap back. So if you are one of the rare people who watches this channel despite the fact that every single thing that I say you end up disagreeing with, I am curious as to how you could possibly have thought that micro missions are engaging or interesting or good uses of your time. Because ultimately, we talk about consumer rights, we talk about the power that the consumer has. But realistically speaking, aside from obviously the metric of money for your dollar, or content worth your dollar, right? Like amount of time that you get in terms of a reasonable experience per dollar spent. We talk about that as a ratio that has gone downhill. But realistically speaking, the most important resource you have is time. So given that you want to spend your time on things that are actually rewarding, surely you want to spend your time on things other than shitty micro missions where you're not competed for at all, where the content is just sitting there waiting for you to grind through it. At that point, you can't even really call it content. So interested to hear what other people have to say on this particular topic. That's going to do it for me. Crowpilling out.